some games disappear for years, quietly just fading into conversations and only to return later as legends. Not because they sold the most copies and had the biggest marketing campaigns, but because they left a strange, unforgettable impression for the people who played them. We think Parasite Eve is one of those games. When it released in 1998 on the original PlayStation, it really felt unlike anything else at the time. It mixed cinematic storytelling with role-play mechanics, blending survival horror with science fiction, and built its entire premise around the concept that was just both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The idea that the very cells inside the human body could turn against us. Now here's the thing. For many years, fans have wondered if the series would ever return in a meaningful way. Because the original game became a cult classic, its sequel developed a loyal following, and then the franchise slowly just faded after the PSP title, The Third Birthday. However, recently the conversation around Parasite Eve has started to grow louder. Rumors of a Parasite Eve remake have been circulating across forums, industry speculation channels, and fan communities, and while nothing official has been confirmed, the timing sort of feels right for such a revival. Now look, to understand why this idea of a Parasite Eve remake is so exciting, you have to go back to what made the original game so unique. Because at its core, Parasite Eve wasn't simply a horror game or a horror story. It was a bio-horror mash grounded into real scientific ideas. The plot revolved around mitochondria, the microscopic structure inside cells responsible for generating energy. In the game's fictional interpretation, these mitochondria awaken and evolve into a powerful entity known as Eve, which was capable of manipulating biology itself. It sounds bizarre, but that was part of the game's charm. See, Parasite Eve approached horror from a clinical, almost scientific angle. And instead of ghosts or demons, the threat came from within the human body. The result was a kind of horror that felt strangely believable. It suggested that humans' greatest enemy might not be some external monster, but the hidden systems that keep us alive. So, a modern remake could take that concept and expand it sort of dramatically. Just imagine the opening scene, rebuilt with today's technology, the opera house incident where the transformations all first began. In the original game, it was already disturbing. Audience members spontaneously combusted as their mitochondria rebelled, leaving the protagonist standing in a theater of horror. With modern graphics, lighting and animation, that moment could become one of the most haunting openings in horror gaming history. In fact, the protagonist of Parasite Eve, which was an officer, is also one of the most memorable characters of the late 90s gaming, where unlike many protagonists of that era, she wasn't a soldier or a supernatural warrior. She was a detective caught in an impossible situation, trying to understand something that defied science and logic. Her calm determination grounded the story in a human perspective, which made the escalating horrors feel even more disturbing. And a remake would likely preserve that character's role while expanding her character even further. In fact, modern storytelling techniques could dive deeper into her background, her connection to the whole phenomenon, the psychological toll of facing something that blurs the line between science and mythology. And another fascinating element of a potential remake is the setting, because the original game took place in New York City during the Christmas season. That choice actually created a very eerie contrast between the festive atmosphere of the city and the grotesque biological nightmare that's unfolding beneath it. Today's game engines could bring that version of New York to life with incredible details. We all know that. Imagine wandering through dimly lit Manhattan streets during a winter storm, police sirens, echoing in the distance while something unnatural moves through the darkness, sort of like a Silent Hill game. The remake could expand the city's scale, allowing players to explore neighborhoods that were only hinted at in the original game. Combat would also likely evolve as well. The original Parasite Eve, in case you didn't know, used a hybrid system. that blended turn-based RPG mechanics with real-time environments, which was just shy of something perfect back then. Players could reposition the character during battles while, waiting for her attack gauge to refill. It was an unusual system that made fights feel a little strategic rather than just pure action-based. And a remake could really go all the way and reinterpret that mechanic for modern audiences. Instead of just purely turn-based combat, it might adopt a real-time action system with tactical elements, allowing you to slow down time while selecting abilities or targeting specific enemy weaknesses. The key would be preserving the sense that combat is both methodical and tense rather than just turning it into a straightforward shooter like a Resident Evil remake. With that being said, Parasite Eve's enemies or monsters were never just random creatures. They were animals and humans that were mutated by uncontrolled mitochondrial evolution. Rats, dogs, and even entire ecosystems twisted into something grotesque of its own. A remake could really push this concept so much further, creating enemies that look less like traditional monsters and more like biological experiments that are gone horribly wrong. Another area where a remake could shine is in its atmosphere and sound design, because the original soundtrack was haunting and experimental, blending orchestral melodies with eerie ambient sounds, and a modern reinterpretation of that music could really elevate the experience dramatically. There is also the possibility that a remake might expand the story's scientific themes. The late 90s version of the game was already inspired by real biological theories. Modern science has progressed significantly since then. Genetic engineering, technology, and bioengineering research have become part of the real-world discussion. Maintaining all that tone will definitely be crucial. A remake that leans too far into action could lose the, atmosphere that made the game special. But if the developers strike the right balance, they could really create something that feels both nostalgic and completely modern. What makes Parasite Eve practically exciting is that its core idea still feels fresh. Biological horror that's rooted in science is just as fascinating today as it was back in the 90s. If anything, our growing understanding of genetics makes the concept even more unsettling. And if the series does return, it has the potential to become more than just a nostalgic revival. It could become a modern reimagining of one of the gaming's most unusual horror concepts, a story where the enemy isn't just invading monster, but the hidden biological force that lives inside every human cell. If Parasite Eve ever rises again, it won't just bring back a cult classic. By any means, it will remind players that sometimes the most terrifying horror stories are the ones that are rooted in reality.